Recording in progress. Hi guys, I'm Vlad. I do visualizations, design, and front-end development. Not that like I'm super experienced guy. My background is more like, managing developers and designers, but recently I switched. I know sometimes they call it downshifting, but I'm calling that better shifting or upshifting. I just switched from being manager to being like a, contributor. And I'm enjoying that, and probably will do for the next 5 years. So I'm saying that to tell you that I'm kind of fresh. Like I'm fresh to visualization world. Like let's put it this way. I did that before, and I was a developer before, but I did like a big pause. And right now, like my hands-on experience is relatively fresh. So the thing I'll show today, I'll be showing to myself 1 year back, maybe a bit more. So the bar is really low. If you like a coder or JavaScript developer, that will be super boring for you. But basically my talk is preparation and warm-up before Amelia talk. So feel free to skip if you're a really experienced guy or a girl. But if you're not, that'll be perfect for you, right? So let me share screen. All right, you see my webpage, Observable, right?
Yes.
Great. So what is Observable? Observable, it's a website like GitHub, but not for any kind of source code, is a new medium. But we'll jump into that later. If you had experience with the Jupyter notebooks, like I don't know how we survey people on that live talks. How many of you guys do have experience with the Jupyter notebooks? Like do plus in the chat. So I know, like, is it like 5 or 10 or 50 people? Okay. Okay. Wow. Oh, like 12, like 10 or 12, maybe more people. Okay. So it's like Jupyter notebooks, but nicer in a way that it's pleasant to work with, and it's not about Python, which might be a downside for you if you experience with those. But it's basically Jupyter notebooks with the more attention to UI, all right, and for JavaScript. For those who don't have experience with Jupyter notebooks, it's a like step forward into merging like a traditional, like you have a source code and then you do something here and then you're like, hey, go live or deploy, and then you go and you like seeing your web page. Then what you have recently, that will be like a code sandbox where you have a code on the left side and maybe you can switch between files, right, in the browser. There are multiple resources of that kind, like they call REPL-it, Sandbox, and another one. Like usually when you search through how to do that, how to do this on Stack Overflow or something like that, you have links to those where you can jump and see how it's done. But then you like change something here, and then you're like, all right, how to like run that, and you just see the whole result. In Observable, things are a bit different, and we'll see how. But first thing you see, it's like a bunch of stuff, bunch of interesting stuff, and instantly you feel like, oh, DataVis folks are hanging out here, and that's what I felt like. Definitely, if I join those people, that crowd, I'll be able to do those cool things, right? It's absolutely true. One of the rarest places when the things you see is absolutely true. And if you go to like some interesting thing and you see, oh, Mike, creator of D3, actually founder of Observable, created some interesting thing. It looks like an article with some code samples and some maybe stuff you're not really sure what it is. But the thing is, any article, anything on Observable, you can open and see the source code and change instantly and see how the thing you're changing is affecting the result. You can fork, which is like duplicate, make a copy, you can like. So it's like GitHub, social, data viz all together. But it's not limited to only data visualization. It's really nicely done resource for publishing. So it's like new medium, right? And you can publish, if you want to just publish a text as an article, you can do so. So if you think, hey, where should I write my blog post? And I don't want, a paywall on it. Maybe don't choose Medium and choose Observable for that. Okay. And if you really want to show some visualization and examples, those will be interactive and nicely done. Those will be ready for people to explore, copy, and you can not only publish it here, but I'll show you later, you can take that code which you've made here and use it inside your source code or on your website. Depends on your approach. Do you want NPM and React, or you just want to place iframe as a YouTube video on your website? You can do both with Observable. So that's in a nutshell. Let's go into boring examples, but maybe not so boring if you're not familiar with that. Everything inside Observable notebook is a cell, and a cell is like in Excel. We have cells where you type stuff, and sometimes you can type strings there, and sometimes you can write formulas. Here, instead of formulas, you can actually type. Let's explore what you can do here. So I clicked plus. Plus is adding new cell, and instantly I see, oh, you can write JavaScript, you can write Markdown, you can write HTML or LaTeX, like scientific formula stuff. We'll focus on that, but a simple example. So my goal today is not like teach you everything, but encourage you to try and remove maybe like a suspicious, scary, oh, it's a new thing, I don't trust it. Definitely trust it, because I saw that a year ago, and they keep adding new things and making things better, not worse. So they're not really breaking. It's actually a second version or maybe third version of Observable, like a major one. So if you're familiar with Markdown, I hope everybody, but if you're not, it's just like you can write things in simple text with a couple of special symbols, and Markdown render, whatever it is, supposed to support that. So if you write like header and hit play button, you'll see header, and you see how the cell is open right now. And if you unpin it, you can open and close every cell. So every notebook in Observable consists from cells, which you can open, close, you can open and pin them to be open, and you can change the language in which you're writing the source code of that particular cell. All right. So list one. That's in Markdown. That's supposed to be rendered as a nice list. Okay. You see, simple. Now let's go to, and if I delete everything and hit Shift Enter or play button, it's kind of, I'm removing the cell. So let's go and just explore. We'll go through very simple examples. What you can do here. If you switch to HTML, of course, you can write like a basic, like, I mean, I'm gonna write basic, you can write advanced stuff. View, right? So if you want to write something like just any HTML tag will be supported perfectly. So it's up to you. Like these days, people tend to write such things like simple in Markdown, like 4 stars. Also, you have buttons to do the same thing, place same thing. It's up to you. Another thing is that, like, what if you want the majority of things you do, it's in JavaScript, but you prefer to sometimes write some things in Markdown. And originally, a little bit of history, that observable, it didn't have like Markdown, HTML, tag. Everything was JavaScript. So back in the days when I was exploring that, it was like MD, like a special in JavaScript, it's string literal, but it's basically a different way to call a function by passing some parameters. And a function done in a way that it supports that, you can do that. So you do MD, same thing, all right? But that's cell in JavaScript language. And you can do the same thing with HTML. HTML, of course, is not Markdown, so you have to use some tags. Okay. Any questions? Any questions so far? Maybe somebody confused by something. I don't want to go further unless the thing I'm describing is kind of obvious. I hope so. Okay. Now let's go to a bit deeper. Let's do some like explorational type of things. Let's type a equals 8. What that will be? If we hit Shift Enter, like play that cell, is just what it is, right? If we just do a digit, it's just a digit. What if we do an object? And if you want to write multiple lines of JavaScript code, like this, you see, it's like, oh, I don't know what it is. It's like syntax error, but there's no syntax error because it's valid JavaScript. The thing you need to do is to wrap that in like kind of in JavaScript, it'll be like an object, but it's not because you can write JavaScript. So think about that like, oh, the thing I'm going to write in that cell is like multiple lines, and it's my code. So don't argue with me on that. So if I click Shift Enter, it's updating the cell, and it's like, oh, you basically returning me something I not defined, right? So we do 3 return plus b. So now you see 8, right? So the cell takes the result of my code here, which is cool. So basically, you want to calculate something, write something, you can write it in a code like this and return the value, and the value will be rendered without any extra effort from you. And because we data folks, you might say like, hey, how do I write actual object? If like this, would it work? Undefined, but my object, if it'll be just JavaScript, is defined. And another thing, you have to wrap all that in, I guess it will be valid JavaScript when you wrap stuff in parentheses, is like execute that. And now it's saying, hey, you don't have a comma in the object. Now you see it's object. You can explore it. Any object you return, you can explore it, like inspect the object, like in developer console or somewhere else. So let's do C3. Now let's go to interact. Like, can I use that as a variable, right? How can I use that object somewhere else in another cell when I want to calculate stuff? You have to give it a name. Let's do a name, obj equals. And in a different cell now, let's just do obj.a. You see, you can use the data from one cell in another cell. And it's like the core behind observable notebooks is that all of those cells can interact, depend on each other, and those will be recalculated automatically. So for example, let's do a string plus this. This is number 1, and I'm using object A. What if in another cell I'll replace it with 5, and I update that cell? you see like a little blink of the line here on the left side. It means that the cell is recalculating, and you see the value was updated. And not like the whole notebook, because that cell isn't using object, and it won't be updated, won't be recalculated because it doesn't need to. That's cool. Yeah, it is. Let's go further. If we talk about code, we got to talk about functions, right? So let's define a function. Let's just do function hi, and then return hi there. Okay. As soon as we apply that cell, it's saying inside me there is a function. So in another cell, we can do hey, like space hi, and just call that function. So we're using a name of a cell which you define here in another cell. Same trick, but now there was an object, could be your data, and here's the function. The function could do anything. You can have multiple cells, multiple functions. If you want to have everything, like all your code in a single cell, you can do so. It's up to you how to split two worlds. Also, as I showed you, you can write on HTML and Markdown with special type of prefix, right? But also you can, in JavaScript world, in the browser, we can create those HTML nodes dynamically. So let's do that. Let's do equals document. Let's create component, like, I don't know, p. Then we do p dot. There is no like autocomplete in like all of those general browser API stuff, but there is an autocomplete for some things I'll show you later. You can use, so it's not like completely you're out of autocomplete, but you just yes, there's no autocomplete for things you shouldn't do this way, because doing things that this way is not the best here in observable, because you kind of can do that much simpler. So undefined, because we're not returning, and we will return p. So we, with JavaScript, created a node, HTML node, added the text to it, and returned it. It's like different things to do stuff, but basically that shows you that you can write anything in JavaScript and construct your visual representation. It could be D3, it could be any other library. And let me show you some stuff I prepared already, because it's super boring to type. So let's open that cell, IMHTML. That's what I already showed you, right? It's nothing interesting. There could be a cell which creates a control input, super simple input. And when you evaluate that cell, when you like shift enter, it's just like, hey, I'm like, simple input. So what can you do with it? You can use that as a name itself. Let's do like this, right? So h equals, and then in another cell, you could use that. But as soon as you just type h, it will tell, hey, this is like some HTML element. I don't know what you want me to do with it. So the way to extract value from the cell which outputs a control is to type view of. So basically you're saying, hey, I don't want like that as a component like for JavaScript. I want that as a result as a resulting value. So you see, I'm typing in real time in another cell, which uses that as a value. It updates. And it's really powerful thing. You can collapse all the source code and create using controls, either standard from HTML, or you can use a library, which I show you later. You can import different things, and you can use those controls to drive your visualization. Maybe you're not starting from the like React world. Maybe you just like, hey, I want to do some interactive stuff and like couple variables for my visualization. Observable is the perfect place for that because you can code everything and then rely on a couple of parameters outside, and people can tune those like sliders or inputs or drop downs, and you don't need to create those like I did here. There is a standard library, and I'll show you how to use it, but I'm almost done. I don't show you like a bunch of coding anymore. I just show you how more complex things are created. So a thing we already seen is like, hey, this is the variable, and the variable gets result of something. You do something in JavaScript. Here you creating a bunch of random numbers, and as soon as you return those, you can see, oh, it's an array, right? So it's an array and just a bunch of numbers. That's what it is. Pretty simple. And in another cell, you defining a variable like a string variable, and it doesn't matter the order of those cells. So for example, I could define variable before that. So I could just like drag and drop those cells between each other, which is kind of cool. And here, this is the visualization, pretty simple one. How it's done. It's a piece of JavaScript code which returns the canvas. Canvas is like a raster DOM node, raster picture inside browser on which you can draw. And here's like, okay, I'm creating that context, and I'm like beginning the path, moving here, and like there's a cycle, and like I'm doing line join, and then I just do stroke. So a little bit of a Canvas API, but there's nothing crazy here, right? You can figure it out. The only thing that initially you're like suspicious about, like what is DOM? I've never like I don't know about what it is. And what it is, you will see a lot of those things in observable notebooks. Is now you can really the right place to explore stuff will be click learn and then click documentation. They do have that recently. So here, basically, you can go into any section and see much more complex description of what's possible, how to do that. Two things I want to point out is libraries. So first is creators of observable prepared for you bunch of useful things like DOM, which we saw right now, database client, like the user, the way to, we saw that markdown, render HTML, some SVG helper functions, the way to extract width of the current visual cell, and different other things. So it's like standard library, this is called. The way you use those, you just use the predefined name which is available for you, like kind of class or something, and it's just helper functions to not write code like create node or something. You can do DOM context2D, and here we go. So very helpful. So you have to learn those in order to use those, but once you learn, it's a bit simpler. Now, there is a way to use recommended libraries. Libraries which we'll explore. D3, one of those. D3 is actually not a library; it's a set of libraries. So a set of libraries, like different libraries united under D3 world. And Jesus, spamming on the phone. It's so. How do I turn it off? Observable inputs and plot. Maybe we'll cover plot in our next meetup. Quite interesting thing. Inputs It's a library of different inputs, sliders and stuff. And the way you use the library is just using its name. But before you do that, let's just scroll down. Yeah, it's like those libraries are there, like pretty easily available. Like you just use a proper name of the library, which you see here, and they are here because they're very popular. Vigalite is visualization in declarative way. So if you prefer to configure in JSON type of thing, like a key value, your visualization engine, Vigo would do a lot of good stuff for you. So without any programming. D3, it's more like you have to, type what you want exactly. And plot is their simplification of D3, like less customization, simpler to use, and for exploration, and other like libraries like using SQLite. But the great thing about observable is actually you can use any other JavaScript library out there. The way to do that is to use a require language, which is a different way of importing stuff. And the name you're using here is, to not be super confusing, it's from here. So whatever you import with the name will be extracted from JS-deliver, which is gigantic resource which unites everything. So basically, if there is a JavaScript library and it's not only on your computer, probably you can import that inside observable, like, hey, variable name require that library. And later you can use methods, variables, functions of that library, like doing name of which you defined and then dot, and here we go. And I hope we'll see that in practice in D3 later. But with that, two things like interactivity, you can change a value one cell, another cell will be updated, importing any JS library, and have a really good default standard library, really helpful. But more than anything else, I think that observable trying to position themselves like as a medium, it's probably the best way to learn JavaScript and data visualization right now, because guys and girls there, like there's quite a team, they do a lot of education by writing those articles. And like, you're new to JS, you don't know like some CSS stuff, and you're like, hey, what is like promises? I've never worked with those. And you go inside the notebook and you read stuff, and right there you can use it. So that was my like approach when I like, hey, what's D3? Let me learn it. And I went, and without example is not quite easy to understand. I'll show you one thing I did exactly 1 year back. I had one task on my job, and I wanted like a fast prototype without damaging or being dirty in my like source code repository. I wasn't sure what I'm doing, so I just like, okay, let me do that in observable. So I went there and I uploaded CSV file. By the way, files are just like, okay, here are the files you can attach. You can drag and drop the file there. You can connect to database if you want, like if you like security permissions allowed, yada yada. So nothing crazy. I'm just naming the variable and like parsing my file with D3, and I'm defining some functions which we'll learn later. And like here, I'm just testing that. And then I'm like testing something different, which returns undefined, but it's like, oh, let me just test it. And then like, hey, what's a width? Width is like a variable available in all notebooks for you in all cells by observable. This is the actual width of the window here. And like, hey, let me define the height. And then I did like visualization with D3, which is whatever, a bar chart with some zooming and drag and dropping. It's kind of not finished, but was helpful for me. And it's not super big of a code. Primarily copy paste from other notebooks, which I saw, but there was the nicest way to learn stuff. Super simple, clarified. Of course, you need to spend a bit more time on, it's not like UI ready for you to visualize anything. But I believe like the more we go into that world of coding becomes like a grammar. So it's basically talk, read, write, and code too. So more and more people are familiar with that. It's less like I hope developers in future will earn less money compared to a lot of the people. Right now, developers are kind of privileged. And so like the trend is there. More developers will come, and this is the best way to learn stuff and do that. And like back in the days, D3 was like this. You have to import D3, but right now it's not even that. D3 is just available for you as a variable. Usually in observable notebooks, you see appendix where they import a bunch of stuff from other places and they use it like on top, because there is no particular order, because every cell returns something and re-evaluate it. And I think going forward, I see more and more companies doing that. I work at the company who does open notebook engine, or like with a different set of requirements and vision. But the idea is that let people code and observe the results instantly, and there will be a presentation mode. If you don't want people to see the code, you can collapse code in one way or another. Here in observable, it's really cool. So about publishing stuff, I can easily publish that as any Google Doc by some name, whatever. I can public unlisted, like even upload the thumbnail. And another thing which might developers be worried about, like, hey, how can I use it in my projects? And the way you do that, you embed cells. You can embed entire notebook, and you can say, hey, I want to use it like an iframe. Here's the code to use. And if you want just a JavaScript and observable, it's, I don't know how do they do business, but they do almost everything open source. You do have to pay for some extra features, but you can use majority of that, the biggest and the most powerful thing, absolutely for free. And here's the way to use like pure vanilla JavaScript and import your observable. And this is the way to use it in React. You import the observable runtime, and you import the code of your particular notebook, and then like a little piece of initialization, and you have it. So really, that I think that's the best medium for doing stuff. Now, any of your questions, please ask me something. The one ring of JavaScript. I'm sure. So it's not only like Vega Lite. I think you can import Vega. You can import any other JavaScript. I think it's really nice place to start prototyping. If you're not sure what you're doing, of course, if you're like developer exactly, like you have design and you want to develop something, you go into the JavaScript. But if you don't, like right now, I really feel like opening a code sandbox is like too much, and I just want to like output some stuff in JavaScript and see what will be the result of that. You're not sure about something, you want to quickly try that. This is the place to try, and you can invite team members for free. You can have like 4 people simultaneously coding. You can share with the world you've done, and for visualization folks, I think that will be the way let's go into observable. Just one thing I want to show you. I think that's the place for visualization folks, because it's pulling more and more attention. You have like, hey, Stuff Pixel, some promotion of their thing or your thing. They creating templates. It's basically a ready-made visualization. You can just like, hey, provide your source or uploading your data. You have everything done for you. Creating dashboard from arbitrary databases with a bunch of flexibility. This is the way, like importing some libraries like Excel components from GitHub npm also. featured creators, the people who are does things and promoted here. You can go like, what's up with that visualization? Let me see how it's done. Click open and like, oh, that's how you do that. Let me copy that. Let me do something like this. How do you do that? Oh, here's how you do that. Legend. What's the legend? Legend probably is like a function or imported somewhere like, yeah, color legend. So really is like impossible to imagine 5 years ago there'll be anything like that. But I really like and inspired by Observable, mostly inspired. I don't use it on a daily basis, but sometimes when I use it, I really like everything about it. I think that's like one of the best examples of the UI and services out there.
Yeah, so it looks like there's one question about observable as a function for data ops or data management.
It's like, I don't understand the question, to be honest. So if you can clarify that, I'll be able to better answer that. It's not like a solution you must rely on. It's very nice sandbox, but if you build some stuff around that, for example, the observable page will be the place for your team to, observe some data visualized, and the data source will be your database. Is it safe? I think if it's very simple to import the whole code and have the whole code in your repository, including the observable runtime, I think it's pretty safe to rely on it and really do a smooth transition. Is it a place to transform data in like, probably not. It's not like something, if you want that to be admin panel, maybe you can do that, but I'm not sure. So could you clarify what exactly is the question?
Vlad, do you want to come off mute and explain your question or type it in the chat?
How well the internal states of a system can be inferred from knowledge? Well, are you talking about your system or are you talking about observable system? I guess it's yours is like how good something done depends on you. How do you do that? It's a very, like, basically think of observable as like another way to create and deploy code with a very low entrance, and you can pull people who are not familiar with the code really fast to check things out and even comment on your cells or bookmark them. So it's not like any JS library. Don't think that observable is like D3 focused. D3 is example of something that was really complex to get into and understand, requires a lot of effort and patience. But now you can just go there, see how it's done, open the source code, and really like extract pieces of what you need, or with the templates done by somebody, just upload your data. So they decrease level of entrance into the visualization, like by democratizing it, if you wish. So it's not about D3, it's about any primarily JavaScript based thing. Can you use observable runtime inside Python or like vice versa? Yeah, there are different intentions, but at the end of the day, it's like more a JavaScript ecosystem. So you're not managing your data processes and system with observable. Same would be like, hey, is Google Docs a replacement of CMS in order to create content and publish on our corporate website? Well, it's not in a way, because it shouldn't be the main engine, right? You shouldn't create your website based on the spreadsheets, although people do that and enjoy. but you do use it to prepare content. And it's a nice way to prepare content because you can review, comment, version that, and you can do all the same things with the observable notebooks. Version them, comment on them, update them, import, export stuff. So I don't think that they inferred the name, like observable is a pattern in software. It's like data type, or it's just, don't think that, yeah. Observable, I think, is like you can observe data better. Just a name. Don't stress out on that. Any other questions? No questions? All right, now the cool stuff, D3.
Awesome, thank you so much.
All right, Amelia, I am happy to give you an introduction that I shamelessly stole from your website. But if you wanted to kind of just jump in, I think we are ready to hear what you have to say and see what you have to show.
Yeah, I have no idea what my website says, so curious what it sounded like, but let's see. I'm Amelia. I moved to DC 1 week before the pandemic. I was very excited to move to somewhere with such a big data viz meetup. And then I've been in my house for a year and a half, but I'm excited to be here, at least virtually. I do R&D at GitHub, where I kind of think about what might the future of developer experience look like, kind of do explorations there. And I'm fairly new to this job. Before that, I was working at The Pudding. They do like data-driven essays. Their website is pudding.cool, and they are very cool. So if you like data and you haven't heard of them, definitely check them out. And I'll get through as much as I possibly can. I think it was very overambitious. I think I'm supposed to stop at 7:20. So I'll go over a little, and the code's all online. So for anyone who's curious, please check it out. I kind of put everything I wanted to cover in this observable notebook. If anyone wants to follow along, there's also going to be a complete code example as well. All right, so I want to talk about D3. And I think this is like a really good pairing of talks, because now I can dive into observable, and Vlad, you already kind of introduced D3. And I think you did a really good job of it. So the way I think about making charts in the browser is there's like a whole spectrum of libraries. On the left here, we have really high level chart libraries like chart.js, where it's really simple, it's really quick. You can make a scatter plot with probably 1 line of code. Make your life easy. If you just need a simple chart, use that for sure. In the middle is probably Vega Lite, which you mentioned, and then observable put PLT plot on top of that. And then all the way at the other end, probably as low level as you can get for a library, is D3.Js. It'll make your life hard. It has a steep learning curve, but anything you'll see from the New York Times or Washington Post, where they have these really custom interactive visualizations. Okay, thanks, Jill. Stressing out over here. Yeah, so D3, it's harder, but one, it really teaches you like what are the different steps that go into making a chart, which is something I really appreciate about it. And two, you can really get crazy. So I tried to get screenshots of things I've worked on recently where these are all built with D3. There's like a custom dashboard in here. There's custom maps. This is a map made up of pie charts in case you love pie charts. Yay, this is a viz of lunar missions, which was a client project maybe a year back. This was like a splashy intro to an office that I made that we put up on a projector, which shows precipitation and time and temperature. This is a fun game for like people to play while watching the presidential debate. Not many people played it, but I enjoyed it. This last one I'll talk about. This is something I did recently, which I really enjoyed. This was something for work, and it was an exploration of, we always look at code bases as like a directory structure, but how could we enhance our understanding of code bases if we instead, this is like a relaxed circle pack diagram. So each circle is a file. And I was trying to explore, like, what if we saw code bases like this? Could this give us a better understanding of how big is it? What types of files does it use? That kind of thing. I can drop that link. This is a link to the write-up. All right, so you can make a lot of different things with it, which makes it worth, depending on who you are, the steep learning curve. Yeah, thank you, Jill. All right, so how do I get started? So I usually like to introduce D3 with this diagram. It's a little bit overwhelming, but basically each of these larger circles is one module within D3. D3 is made up of a bunch of different modules, which is what was said earlier. And each of these is actually its own GitHub repository. So like D3 scale or D3 colors helps you manipulate colors. And then each of these smaller dots within it is a different method or function within that. So here's one that has all the projections. If you want to make a map, and you can see each of these is an individual projection. So everything in purple is inside the core build of D3. So if you're using D3, you have access to everything here in purple, or you could just use one of these by itself. So it's definitely overwhelming, but I think what I want to stress here is that you don't have to learn the entire library at once. You don't have to quote unquote learn D3. And there's definitely things that I haven't used, and I've written a book about using D3. Like there's a lot of these that I haven't used. I also split them up into like, what are common tasks that you'll do while visualizing data? So there's manipulating the data, drawing shapes, dealing with colors. So you can see like there's kind of groups of these, but they're each pretty isolated. So feel free to learn one or pick them up as you find necessary to do whatever task you need to do. And then the other thing for making it easier to wrap your head around D3 is I like to split it out into concrete steps. And we'll kind of walk through each of these steps in a little bit of detail further down in this document. The steps are, first you have to get the data, and then you have to create the dimensions of the chart. You have to draw the chart stage. You have to create your scales, you have to draw your data, and then the peripherals, and then you have to set up interactions if you are going to have any. And then there's a link to this code sandbox that I don't have open. Go back. All right, so in this code sandbox, we have the entire code that's in this observable notebook, but just kind of isolated because it can be a little bit confusing to follow along in observable. So final code here, kind of like code interspersed with some comments in here. All right, so the first step is grabbing your data. And here I'm doing a file attachment. Like you saw earlier, we're looking at the DC weather. This is mid 2019 to mid 2020, just because I had it lying around. You can see this is an array of objects. Each object is one day, and it has a lot of metrics for each day. This is why I like to use this data set, is there's a lot of data here. So the second part of getting your data is looking at the data. There's this other notebook I made, which makes a matrix of your data. This is a similar data set where each row is a metric, and then it has a color scale looking at the different values within the entire array for that metric. So if we sort by date, we can see it goes from January all the way to December. Yeah, this is not part of D3. This is just something I like to use when I'm exploring data to kind of figure out what is the best way to visualize this, where are some patterns. There's some interesting things here where like you can see we usually don't get precipitation, but when we do, get a lot, it's usually snow, whereas rain is further down here with lower amounts of precipitation, which I thought was kind of interesting. So find some view of your data before you go through all the trouble of visualizing it, or use one of those chart libraries that make your life really easy. And then you can create a more custom one later once you've figured out, hey, this is data that's going to make sense to visualize in this way. And then the second part of getting our data set is to create accessor functions. So accessor functions are kind of a D3 convention. And I just like to use them because they make your life really easy. So basically, we're turning data metrics into physical characteristics. And for each of those physical characteristics, I'll usually make an accessor function that takes one data point, so a day, and it returns the metric that we're going to visualize in that physical characteristic. So for example, let's pull out an example day, and then we're going to make a Y accessor function, which is basically just going to pull out the value from this data point that we want to visualize on that Y-axis. So we're going to make a scatter plot of the high temperatures for each day over time. So for the Y-axis, we want that temperature high. You can see that right here. So we're just taking that object and returning this value. So if we call Y-accessor with our sample data point, you'll see the high for this day was 82. If we look at the next data point, it was a little cooler. If we look at the third data point, it was a little bit warmer. So you'll see why these are helpful a little bit later. And then we also created an accessor function for the x-axis, which is just telling us how many pixels over is this point going to be. And so for that, we're grabbing the time. We have to multiply it by 1,000 for fun date time reasons. And then we're turning it into a JavaScript date time object, which is what this is, even though it looks like a string, it's an object. Feel free to shout out questions as well. I'm looking at the chat. All right, so now that we have our data, if we look at the full code example, really all we've written so far are these two accessor functions. And they're really nice to have at the top in case your data changes its structure. And then you just change it in this one place and you know where it lives. All right, so the second step is creating your chart dimensions. This is another kind of D3 convention is you need to know the dimensions of your entire chart, and you'll also need to know the dimensions of just the data portion of your chart. And this will be helpful for scales later. But there's this convention of you set the width of the entire chart and the height, and then you figure out the margins you want on all of the sides outside of your data. And then you figure out, I call this the bounds, just where the data is going to be. So for example, I'll make this margins object. I'll set the width and the height, and then to get the width of the bounds, I just do the entire width minus the right and left margins, and then the same for the height. And then you'll get something like this where the data sits in this blue container and the peripherals sit outside. So you can see if we say didn't do any margin on the left-hand side, we wouldn't have any room for our axis. So it's nice to have that and then be able to change it really quickly. to make room. Maybe your text needs to be larger than you thought it needed to be. All right, so here's another thing that is often skipped, I think, when people jump into learning D3 is SVG. It stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. Basically, it's hard to do anything in HTML other than draw boxes. So SVG is going to help you draw like all of these different shapes. And it's this different language that you can fit within HTML. So you'll see if I click on this triangle here, we have this SVG element, which tells the browser, hey, we're switching to the SVG namespace, and then all of the elements within SVG, within the SVG element need to be SVG elements. Probably not explaining that well, but I also have listed out, this is just something I'm playing with, but I thought it would be helpful of, there's basically 7 shapes you can make with SVG. There's rectangles, there's circles, there's lines, there's also text. And basically with this circle, they all have different attributes, which I find really frustrating. The circle you position with the CX and CY value. The rectangle you position with XY width and height. Polygons you position with a series of points here, so you can see those move around as I move this. And then the big one for doing custom shapes that you'll use in D3 for like line charts is this path element, where you get this cookie string of like commands. So you say, go to this position and then draw a line to this position. And it's really hard to write by yourself. And D3 can help you with that. But basically that's SVG. That's usually what you'll see charts drawn in. You could also use Canvas, like Vlad showed earlier, to do his random walk. There are some trade-offs there. But SVG is generally a little bit easier to work with. All right, so that's SVG. Now we can start drawing where we're gonna put our chart. And we'll see this cookie observable syntax, which is using this, I think it was hypertext language library. It was one of those core libraries for observable. But basically all we're doing is we're creating an SVG element. And then we're hooking into that by using D3.select. And basically D3.select is going to help you select parts of and then modify pieces of the web page. So here we're selecting this SVG element. We can also do it in this example, we have an SVG with an ID of chart, and then we're hooking into it with D3 select, and then just passing, we want the element with an ID of chart, and that hash is just specifying it's going to be an ID. And what this returns is this cookie object that has a groups key and a parents key. Not really important what's actually in here. What is important is that this groups key has an array of elements that D3 has selected from the DOM, and then within any selection object, there are all of these methods to help you change or query or manipulate any elements within this array. So there's data for binding DOM elements to specific data points. There's some important ones that we'll use are ATTR, which stands for attribute, where you can set different attributes on an SVG or HTML element. Style helps you set CSS styles, and then append is also good to know, where kind of like we saw earlier with the native append child, it'll add an element into whatever element you've selected. So first off, we can grab that object and use this ATTR method to set both the width and the height of our SVG. But by default, you can't really see an SVG because it's I think its background is transparent. So let's give it a border by using .style. So now we can see our SVG, it's the width we wanted. I think that's 800 and it's 400 pixels tall. And then within that object, we can also append a G element. G just stands for group, and it's kind of like div, where it's just like a container for things. And then let's look at what that looks like. We're gonna put a rectangle inside of that and give it a background. So that's here. And we've set it to the width and height of our bounds. And then what we want to do is have it respect the top and left margin. So let's transform it, and then we'll move it over by the left margin and down by the top margin. And here we go. So these are our bounds. And you can see that looks a lot like this diagram, where we have our wrapper, we have our bounds, and now we are ready to move on with our lives and start creating some scales. So in the end, that code all just looks like this. Just make sure I can see chat, just in case. All right, so step 4, create scales. Scales are a really important concept for drawing charts. They're basically functions to help convert between the data domain and the physical characteristics that you need to use. So for our, I should say, x-axis, for our x scale, we want to convert, that's silly. Okay, so this is the y scale. We can do that one first. So for the y scale, we want to convert between degrees Fahrenheit, and we want to turn those into pixels from the top of the chart. So data domain and physical range, it's just, I get those mixed up all the time, and that's my internal, I say that to myself every time I make a scale.
Me too.
It's really confusing because they don't inherently mean anything. All right, so first we have to get the minimum temperature and the maximum temperature to figure out the extent of this domain. These min and max methods, the first parameter is your data set. The second parameter is going to be an accessor function to grab the temperature value from each item. And then it'll find the minimum temperature and the maximum temperature. And then you can create a linear scale. D3 has a lot of different scale types. There's like log scales, and you can get crazy with it, but usually you'll probably be using a linear scale. And then you'll set the domain to go from the minimum temperature to the maximum temperature. And then the range goes from the height of your bounds to 0. So that's this part. So with this, we can use this to, let's see, we'll pass it our first data point. Nope, that's not how that works. Okay, so what we can do is we can say, where would 50 degrees be on the chart? So you can see if we had a circle that was 50 degrees, it would be 256 pixels down from the top of the chart. So that's how these scale functions work. And then we want to do the same for the x scale. That goes from the first state to the last state, and we want it to go from 0 to the width of the bounds. We can see this is the last state. It goes until 2020 June 6th. So that's going to be probably the width of our bounds, because it's going to be all the way over on the right. So those are scales. Definitely will take a little bit of time to wrap your head around if you aren't familiar with them, but they're really powerful. I end up using them all the time, even if I'm not visualizing data, I use them for like a calendar widget. I don't know, very useful. All right, so this next step is about drawing the data. This is the exciting part, and it's really only 6 lines of code. So D3 can be really powerful, even though it's really low level. So what we're doing here is this is a really tricky part of D3 too. So what we're doing is we're creating a D3 selection object of all of the circles inside of our bounds, of which there are none to start with. which is the confusing part here. But it's basically saying we're mapping to all of the circles inside of this chart. And then we're binding those to every item within our data set. So we're saying for each object in our array, we want one circle. And that's what this is. It's joining it with the circle element. So it says we want to create one circle for every item in that array. One of the cool things here is that each of these circle elements actually has a data property on it, which I didn't know for a while, and this kind of blew my mind when I figured it out. So if we scroll all the way down the properties list, this item on our webpage actually has a data property that has all of that data on it. So this is how D3 is binding that data to these elements. And then when you say things like, I want the attribute to CX to have a value of something, you can use a function. Like we could just say 10, and they all are gonna be at the 10 pixels over from the Y axis. Or we can use a function where the first parameter is a data point, and then we grab that date value from the data point, and then we pass it through our X scale, which then outputs. So this one has an X position of almost 400 and a Y position of 300. Definitely a little confusing. Please let me know if there's like a specific thing that I can explain again. The main point here is that we're binding each item of the data set to a circle element, and then using that, passing it to our accessor function, passing it to the scale function, and then outputting this physical value to put the circle in the right place. And this concept probably takes people, it takes a lot of people like a long time to wrap their heads around, but it can also be really powerful.
So I have a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So what happens if you don't pass it through your scale function? Does D3 just interpret the number as a number and put it kind of where it would go otherwise, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we don't pass it through the scale, we're gonna grab that, whatever our accessor function is returning. So this is a date, and the browser doesn't really know what to do with that value. We could also do this for the Y scale, which is kind of cool because this is kind of just a squish version of our chart, because we're using the actual temperature values as the Y axis. So like it kind of works, but you want to translate those into like the right place for however tall your chart is.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what that scale is doing. It's saying, let me convert from a temperature value into the pixel value for this chart.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Awesome. So these scale functions are actually more powerful than just doing some kind of linear interpolation. So the next step is drawing your peripherals. And this is where D3 does, it like kind of gives you some shortcuts where I'm going to kind of breeze through this, but it has these different axis functions that you can just say, I want it on the bottom. I want it to use this scale. And then that's all you really need. You'll create a group element. You don't even need this part. And then I'll move it down to the bottom of my chart. And then what you do is with this generator is you pass it this new group element, and then it'll draw that that axis for you. Just knowing that this is the input to the scale. We know the physical output of the scale. We're going to put the ticks in the right place. Sometimes you need to give it a few more hints, like how many ticks you want or what format you want that to be in. Hold on. Sometimes observable doesn't re-render it. Yeah, so I said, I want you to aim for 5 ticks. It won't take this number exactly. And I want you to format it month, day, year. So that's what it does. There's a lot of methods on these functions. Like D3 is a deep rabbit hole. So this is like really the bare minimum you need for creating a chart, but you could get really crazy and make it really custom. So you want to do the same for the y-axis. You want to put it on the left side, say we want 5 ticks, and then you just call that generator on a new group and it'll throw it over on the left-hand side. This last bit, I'm gonna skip. It's not important. This is, although it is part of what's really cool about learning D3 is you learn how to make interactive charts that you can send someone and they can zoom in on or mouse over, get a tooltip. I think that's part of why the web's really powerful, where you can just send someone something, they can open it up, they don't have to download anything, and then they can interact with it as they want, which the key here is this .on method on selection objects, where you can specify what event do you want to listen for, and then here's what you do when you hover over that specific item. And then the last thing here is just, you're gonna say, okay, that's not custom at all, that's just a basic scatter plot. You're totally right, but I think what I wanted to convey was the building blocks for creating charts, where you can take this chart now and say, add this little bit of code, and now you have lines with circles. You can, add whatever the heck you want. You can get really crazy with it. These are really the basic building blocks of creating custom charts that are, as crazy as your imagination can get. So, yeah.
Like having like, now, if temperature is like this, you want to make those red. If it's like this, you want to make those blue. And you just add and add logic, and it does not become more complex. It becomes more easier.
Yeah, exactly.
After the heavy lifting.
Like, there we go. Custom. That's all I got.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so keep in mind, guys, that like somebody with some GS experience might be confused by D3 a bit, because it's like, oh, it can select items and then it can update values of DOM elements. Keep in mind that D3 was created before React, all right? It was like an era of browsers and not quite support everything. It was jQuery still with us at that time. And that legacy, there was a D3, like Mike did D3 as a library to do like everything, right? So there's all sorts of convenience there. Right now, you're like, hey, I have a React, and how should I use like D3 there? There are different types of methods, but keep in mind that D3 is just namespace for collection of libraries. If you want extract minimum value from the array of abstract items with some logic inside, like as a JSON, there is a like, hey, extract minimum thing from my array of objects. And D3 has like convenient function for that. So it's like nothing even to draw, just use that. And sometimes you do want to draw things. Sometimes you use like JavaScript methods to go through all the points of your data, like basic map functions, and then you use D3 just to, just to update them. So it's like really fine-tuned solution to whatever you want in a functional way, as you saw, like dots do this and then dot do this and then dot do this, because it's like you're chaining those methods, and really convenient.
So this was super, super cool. If folks have gotten excited and want to learn more, Amelia, what kind of resources would you suggest to learn more about D3?
I tried to collect some thoughts, and there's a blog post intro to D3, which goes a little bit further into, I was typing something, hold on, into what are the different parts.
Observable, you go to observable, type intro to D3, like there are a gigantic set of nice articles. So right now, I think observable actually the best place to start learning, because you have description by creator of D3, how stuff is working. It's really helpful.
I have a question, if no one minds if I ask a quick question. It's for both of you. Could you speak a little bit to maybe either how to word this, the difference between learning D3 and writing D3 in something like Visual Studio and learning D3 and writing D3 in Observable? And I asked, I'll give you context. So I've been learning D3 using Visual Studio, setting up my own server here, getting a web server going and just working on it, looking on the browser, going to the console. Is it more that you've worked in these tools in tandem, or is it that people are moving exclusively to Observable and working in D3 and then embedding their graphics onto the web through there? Or how do you see the relationship between these different ways of writing D3?
I would say that Observable is really good for prototyping and for learning. It's also a little bit different than JavaScript, which can be a little bit confusing, and like porting it outside, although you can embed it, can be really weird. And so if you want to make like a website with a custom visualization, then I would do it just with a code editor, with a local server, just however you would make whatever website. But if you want to rapidly prototype with data and maybe learn parts of D3, Observable is a good place to do that, because you have the like live updating, and you can use, they actually have custom controls that you can use, like sliders and stuff like that. So you can play around with things really easily.
So you can absolutely create one cell with all of your code the way you do that in VS Code, right? The only difference is like in Observable, like the result is like vertically up, like up, and you're writing code, and you're like, maybe if it's a code too long, you have to scroll down and up. And in VS Code or any other like sandbox that Amelia showed you, like, hey, it's easier when you know stuff and you don't want to have like any other controls except your code, like having side by side, and you know programming, that might be easier. But if you want to expose some variables, you want to clarify whether those values of the variables you're using inside like every function, that's probably observable. For people who already learned that and know how to use it, yeah, of course, you're writing a code and you see result faster, you know what you're doing exactly. So the purpose is different, right? Like writing code for end result, or writing code for somebody to maybe explore that and see that. And again, you can write everything in one cell of observable, close that code, or maybe you write everything inside your VS Code and then you grab that code, you paste that inside observable, and you keep writing your article about whatever thing you want to do. So it depends on what the end result, and you can use multiple tools for different things, depends on the priorities.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I had a similar experience as Corey, where I started doing, the D3 stuff with the sandbox and kind of been flipping back and forth to the browser, and it was really complicated. But then when I tried Observable, this was probably a year or two ago, it wasn't linear. So I didn't know how to translate what I was learning in this like really linear fashion, and ended up getting a lot of errors, and it became really frustrating. And I haven't been back to Observable since then. So I really appreciate like this context of like, okay, well, either I was making it too complicated or maybe it's easier now, but yeah, to kind of play around and explore a little bit more. And now I understand how all of the things work. So I appreciate both of your presentations.
Yeah, like writing interactivity in observable in D3 purely, it's a bit hard. Like, hey, how could you do like make a slider and place that slider? Like, all right, I need really to make all the interactions. In observable, like okay, there'll be a slider in that cell, and there'll be a result in that cell, and you separate those. So usually confusion about those cells comes like when every gotta be a separate cell. No, it shouldn't. It could be everything in one cell. it's up to you how divided, and yeah, it requires a bit of experience, but when you go in any other notebook, you'll appreciate that it's an observable, because yes, it's not like super fast. Oh, I got everything. They import some function, it's like down the notebook and it's like there, it's not linear, right? But if you get the whole that code in a GitHub, it won't be easier to figure it out. It's like gigantic, functions and stuff. Here in observable, you have some clarifications and you can touch that without installing a server or whatever and see how it's changing stuff. Oh, it's not that thing. Oh, that's what changes the color. Oh, that's what changes the shape. So it's not like the better world. It's different, and we think it's easier, but it's not completely like, hey, I'll learn D3 in one day. Probably not. but if you want, it's easier to start. If you don't, there are a bunch of different things, including like a new plotting library by creators of observable, which is not like super obvious, by the way. There are better libraries in JS where like, oh, give me chart, x-axis, y-axis, take that field and that field, you're done. It's not the most simplest thing, but if you want to do custom, this is the thing. And let's explore other libraries and other approaches with the different speakers to see, what's the better experience and how they're different. I think everybody needs different contexts to really appreciate or understand when they can use what, rather than just thinking, oh, D3 is the library. Like it could be any other library. You really need to be a bit more educated around it.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple questions in the chat.
Can D3 be used with Angular? Now we see questions by confused developers. Yeah, it can be used with Angular, but keep in mind that, so the concept of D3, when we saw select this and do that, it's actually changing the DOM. And like with Angular these days, I'm not exactly sure how, but you at all times, D3, like Angular React, you can give to D3 exact DOM and then let D3 do the magic. You can also do it in a different way. You can use D3 math crunching functions and then just do like assemble SVG yourself with your hands. Is not that hard. So you don't have to use D3, which manipulates the DOM, but you still can use D3 libraries which number crunch, like scale, like other like min-max finding stuff, and maybe you'll use D3 functions for drawing the axis. Maybe you'll draw your axis. It depends. So definitely you can use D3 in whatever other framework. It just yeah, could be confusing experience, but drop me a line. I'm open to help, because I was really confused by how do I join those two worlds. One world is like huge legacy and super powerful, and another world is kind of cool and new and my organization uses. So how do I marry them?
Yeah, Amelia, I'd love to hear your response to one of the other questions that we had about what advice you would have for a reporting or visualization team that wants to add D3 to an existing foundation and standard tools like Power BI or Tableau.
Yeah, I was just trying to think about this one. It's a little bit tricky, I think, because they're going to be totally separate workflows. Like, I don't think you can use a chart you made in D3 with a Tableau chart. Although I think you can do custom JavaScript, so maybe. I would say D3 is really good for production charts. So like if you want to play around with data in like a BI tool, but then do something for a blog post, or you want to share an interactive visual, then D3 is really good at that. Tableau is also really good at that though. So I don't know, that's a tough one.
And just that was my question. I've got a team and it's like we do a lot of volume, and there's like I'm learning, and now we're bumping our heads on like more and more sophisticated use cases, and it's hard to switch the brain from just being, you know, a mill house of just you know, these types of reports, and then when you have to do something creative. And so it's like I'm seeing now the two worlds. I think a lot of you coming from more of the front end development world versus folks from more of the been doing BI and slinging data around for many years. And I've sort of like made the point to my team a number of times, if you call a carpenter to your house and they say they only know how to assemble IKEA furniture, you'd be like, you're not a carpenter. So we have to, you know, kind of climb that. And so I'm just looking for ways to get them what they need to know, when to kind of, first of all, to learn new things, and secondly, when to maybe say, all right, let's take this Power BI dashboard or whatever, you know, put a wrapper around it, maybe, you know, embed some JavaScript in that or some D3 in that to add a little bit more functionality and custom stuff. So this is all new to me. So thank you for the good overview.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And the only other thing I'll say for that is I think the key is low expectations, because if you have a team that's really good at like a Power BI tool, they're going to be used to cranking out things really quickly. But then D3 is so low level that it's going to take a while to get up to the same speed with it. But it's totally worth it for doing really wacky things, I think.
And one, I'll just add there real quick. Power BI and a lot of other BI tools usually have fairly expensive plans to embed analytics in a like customer facing website. So that could be another point where you would want to switch over and rebuild a BI dashboard in D3 so that you can embed it without having to pay those costs.
Or use observable to any other library, which might be simpler to port your whatever Tableau is, and use that. Like we like not really keeping in mind how expensive it actually is to grab a product manager, designer, developer, and do like hands off between each other and do like reviews and then like deploys and blah, 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 blah. It costs a lot of money and time. But when you guys sitting together in a single, you know, notebook, and when designer like, oh, I changed my mind, not blue, but pinkish. And he's like, you know what? This is the variable, input any color you like, and we'll use it. And it's much easier to collaborate on those complex things in a single place rather than let's have a meeting and let's, write down Trello cards and then implement and then review. So
that's very true. That's very true. So I think if we've got further questions, we can put those in the chat. We have a Visintel from Shintan. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and show us your project, that'd be great.
Hello, I'm Chintan Savla, and I'm a student at Purdue University. And I've been in the likes of learning D3, and I had come across the profile of Amelia, I think 2-3 weeks ago, and it is nice meeting her. And my project is based on a sport. It's based on a sports dashboard. The sport is called cricket, and it's very popular in the Asian side of and in England. And I can show my project now. So can you see a screen called IPL dashboard?
Yes, we can.
So in this dashboard, what we are trying to find out is how a team in the Indian Premier League performs. So there are 8 teams that participate currently in the league, and rest of the teams have been not participating due to financial issues or some other issues. And so each of these teams, so if we click on a particular team, like let's say the team which has the abbreviation CSK, we would see map chart that would tell us that, okay, they've scored 9,026 runs in this particular venue. So the idea was to show how they perform in each of the venues when they are playing every season. And on this hand, we see what is their win percentage. So this represents how many matches they've won out of all the matches that they've played throughout the inception of this particular league. So for this team, it's 60.98%. And then there's a fact column that would tell us what is their highest score since the inception of the league. So we can see that it's 246 for a loss of 5 wickets. And then when we go down, we can see that it's telling us how many average runs they've scored per season. And if we hover over any particular dot, we would see that they've scored around 159.36 runs. And so the idea is to indicate their performance over years, whether they're improving or they're deproving in their performance. And the same thing can happen for different teams. So the team abbreviated MI, we can see that their high scoring venue is Mumbai, where they've scored 13,394 runs. And this is particularly because this is their home ground where they've played most of their matches. And then we look at their highest score, we can see that it's 223 for a loss of 6 wickets. And it was very recently that they scored. And the ground which they've scored is their home ground called the Wankhede Stadium. And all of this was created through a library called Chart.Js, which is fairly easy as we've seen. And this was just an experiment during COVID because we had nothing much to do since all of us are working from home. So yeah, and the whole idea was to help people of non-statistical backgrounds and non-mathematical backgrounds understand how a team is performing in the IPL, because there are sites like CricBuzz that help you understand how a team performs, but all of this, as you can see, is in a tabular form, which is sometimes not the best way to present data. And so hence the idea of creating a dashboard where people can know how their favorite team performs or how their opponent team is performing currently in the IPL. And I've also been working on an updated version, and I would love to show a template of that if there's no issues.
That'd be great.
This is super cool. Thank you. Yeah.
So in this one, the idea was to include more features so that there's more data presented. And so in this particular one, I'm trying to use D3 because it is more customizable than Chart.Js. And so now let's say we chose the team called CSK, then we can see that they've scored so many runs until a particular period of time. And soon there'll be a drop down menu where we can define a time period. So the particular set, it's defined from 2008 to 2021, but later on we could define it to be from maybe 2016 to 2021 to indicate how they've been performing recently rather than throughout the season, and that'll tell us whether they're actually performing well or not. And the bottom part of this dashboard would feature the same components as these, but with more features where we could be told how many wickets they've taken in each venue instead of just how many runs they've scored. And the line chart would indicate how many sixes they've scored instead of just how many runs they score in average per season. So yes, this was my attempt on creating a database.
This is super cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So on that note, I'm going to end the recording.